The sound of bloodhounds echoed through the dense Maryland woods as Harriet crouched behind a fallen oak tree, her heart pounding like thunder in her chest. 3 escaped slaves huddled beside her, their eyes wide with terror as the barking grew closer. "They're coming," whispered Samuel, his voice barely audible. But Harriet's dark eyes held no fear, only fierce determination. She had made this journey 19 times before, leading over 300 souls to freedom through the treacherous Underground Railroad. Tonight would not be the night they caught Moses. Before we dive into this intense journey, hit that subscribe button, give it a like, and comment below what surprises you most about slave resistance in America. This helps the story reach more people. The year was 1849, and America stood divided by an invisible line that determined whether a human being would live in chains or breathe free air. Below the Mason-Dixon line, 4 million African Americans toiled under the brutal system of slavery that had poisoned the nation's soul for over 2 centuries. Maryland, perched on the edge of this moral chasm, served as both prison and gateway. Its plantations stretched across the eastern shore, where tobacco and corn grew rich from the blood and sweat of enslaved people who dreamed of the North Star. In this landscape of oppression, a woman named Araminta Ross was born around 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland. She would later take the name Harriet, after her mother, and become known to history as Harriet Tubman. But on the day of her birth, she was simply another piece of property belonging to Anthony Thompson, a plantation owner whose wealth was built on human suffering. Dorchester County sprawled across Maryland's eastern shore like a patchwork quilt of marshland, forests, and farmland. The Chesapeake Bay's tributaries carved through the landscape, creating a maze of waterways that would later serve as secret highways for freedom seekers. Tall pines and thick undergrowth provided cover, while the county's proximity to Pennsylvania made it a crucial starting point for those brave enough to attempt escape. The Thompson plantation sat on this unforgiving land, a world unto itself, where white overseers wielded absolute power over black bodies. Wooden slave quarters lined the back of the property, crude structures that housed entire families in single rooms. The main house, with its white columns and wraparound porch, stood as a monument to wealth extracted from human misery. Between these two worlds lay fields that stretched to the horizon, worked by hands that would never own the land they tended. Harriet's parents, Benjamin Ross and Harriet Green, had been enslaved on neighboring plantations before being brought together under Thompson's ownership. Benjamin, known as Ben, possessed skills as a timber inspector that made him valuable to his master. He could identify the best trees for shipbuilding, a crucial ability in Maryland's thriving lumber industry. Harriet Green, called Old Rit by those who knew her, worked in the plantation house, cooking and cleaning for the Thompson family while raising her own children in whatever moments she could steal. The Ross family cabin sat at the end of the slave quarters, a weathered structure with gaps between the wooden planks that let in both winter cold and summer heat. One room served as bedroom, kitchen, and living space for the entire family. At night, parents and children slept on straw mattresses laid across the dirt floor, huddled together for warmth and comfort. Despite the harsh conditions, love flourished within those walls. Ben would tell stories of Africa passed down through generations, while Old Rit hummed spirituals that carried coded messages of hope and resistance. From her earliest memories, young Araminta displayed a spirit that refused to be broken. While other children learned to keep their eyes down in the presence of white people, she met their gaze with unflinching directness. When she was only 5 years old, she was hired out to James Cook, a trapper who lived in the marshlands. Cook's wife put Araminta to work, checking muskrat traps in the freezing waters of winter. The child's small hands would crack and bleed from the cold, but she never complained. Instead, she learned to read the waterways like a map, memorizing every creek and hidden passage. During this time, Araminta contracted measles and whooping cough simultaneously. Cook's wife, viewing the sick child as a burden, sent her back to the Thompson plantation without care. Old Rit nursed her daughter back to health with herbs and remedies passed down from African ancestors, but the experience left its mark. Araminta had seen how easily enslaved people could be discarded when they became inconvenient. As she grew older, Araminta was hired out to various plantations throughout Dorchester County. Each placement exposed her to different aspects of slavery's cruelty. At the Brodess plantation, she worked as a house servant under the watchful eye of Miss Susan, a woman whose sweet smile masked a heart of stone. Miss Susan would whip Araminta for the smallest infractions, moving too slowly, looking up while working, or simply being within reach when the woman felt angry. One morning, when Araminta was about 7 years old, Miss Susan discovered that her sugar bowl was half empty. Without investigation, she blamed the young girl and prepared to whip her. But Araminta had learned to recognize the signs of impending punishment. As Miss Susan reached for the whip, the child bolted from the house and ran into the countryside. For 5 days, she hid in a pig pen, competing with the animals for potato peelings and scraps. Hunger finally drove her back to the plantation, where she received a beating so severe that the scars would mark her back for life. This experience taught Araminta a crucial lesson. There was a world beyond the plantation, and with enough courage one could survive in it. The forests and marshlands of Maryland became her classroom, where she learned to move silently through undergrowth, to find food in the wild, and to navigate by the stars. Skills that seemed like childhood games would later prove essential to her survival and success as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. By age 11, Araminta was working in the fields, her small frame bent over tobacco plants under the scorching Maryland sun. Field work was considered the harshest form of slave labor, but it also offered something the house couldn't: connection with other enslaved people. In the fields, workers could talk quietly as they moved through the rows, sharing news, songs, and stories. It was here that Araminta first heard whispered tales of successful escapes, of a mysterious network that helped freedom seekers reach the North. The field hands spoke in code about the Underground Railroad, though they rarely used that name directly. They talked of following the drinking gourd, the Big Dipper constellation that pointed toward the North Star. They sang spirituals with hidden meanings. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot wasn't just about death and heaven, but about the network of brave souls who helped enslaved people escape. Go Down, Moses told the story of biblical liberation that they believed would come to their own people. Araminta absorbed these lessons like a sponge. She learned that certain spirituals could serve as signals: when to prepare for escape, when it was safe to move, when danger approached. She discovered that quilts hung on clotheslines could contain coded messages, with different patterns indicating safe houses or warning of patrollers. The natural world itself became a language: moss growing on the north side of trees, the position of the sun, the flow of rivers toward Chesapeake Bay and beyond to freedom. Her education in resistance accelerated when she was 13 years old. While in a dry goods store in Bucktown, Maryland, Araminta witnessed an overseer pursuing an escaped slave. When the fugitive broke free and ran, the overseer grabbed a 2-pound weight from the store counter and hurled it at the fleeing man. The weight missed its target and struck Araminta in the forehead, fracturing her skull and leaving her unconscious for days. The injury nearly killed her, and for weeks she lay in the slave quarters, drifting in and out of consciousness while old Rit tended to her wounds. When she finally recovered, Araminta found that the blow had changed her fundamentally. She began experiencing visions and sudden sleeping spells that would last minutes or sometimes hours. Some called it a curse, but Araminta believed it was a gift from God. The visions came to her at unexpected moments, while working in the fields, during prayers, sometimes in the middle of conversations. She would see images of landscapes she had never visited, sense the presence of danger before it arrived, or feel an overwhelming certainty about which path to take through unfamiliar territory. These experiences, which modern medicine might diagnose as temporal lobe epilepsy, became Araminta's secret weapon in the war against slavery. Her master, viewing the injured girl as damaged goods, tried to sell her to settle debts. For weeks, Araminta stood on the auction block as potential buyers examined her like livestock, poking at her muscles, checking her teeth, and discussing her worth in front of her face. But no one wanted a slave prone to sudden sleeping fits, and she remained unsold. The humiliation of those days burned itself into her memory, fueling a rage that would drive her for the rest of her life. During her recovery, Araminta's relationship with her father, Ben, deepened. He had purchased his freedom several years earlier, though he remained on the plantation to be near his family. Ben was a man of quiet strength who commanded respect from both black and white community members. He taught his daughter practical skills: how to move silently through forests, how to read weather patterns, how to identify edible plants and clean water sources. More importantly, he taught her that freedom was not just a dream, but an achievable goal. Ben also shared stories of successful escapes that he had witnessed or heard about through the network of free and enslaved black people who passed information throughout Maryland. He told Araminta about Frederick Douglass, who had escaped from slavery in Baltimore just a few years earlier and was now speaking against slavery in the North. He described the Underground Railroad not as a mystical concept, but as a real network of brave people who risked everything to help others reach freedom. As Araminta entered her teenage years, her reputation as someone who could not be broken began to spread throughout Dorchester County. Other enslaved people sought her out for advice and support. She organized secret prayer meetings where participants would sing spirituals and share news from other plantations. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They provided spiritual comfort, strengthened community bonds, and allowed for the careful exchange of information about escape routes and safe houses. Her growing influence caught the attention of white authorities who viewed any gathering of enslaved people as potentially dangerous. Patrollers, armed white men who policed slave movements, began watching Araminta more closely. But she had learned to be careful, to read people's intentions, and to disappear into the landscape when necessary. The head injury that had marked her as damaged goods had actually sharpened her instincts and strengthened her connection to the spiritual world that sustained her people. The turning point came when Araminta learned that she was to be sold to a chain gang in the Deep South. The rumors started as whispers in the slave quarters, but soon became certainty. Her master's financial troubles had worsened, and he planned to sell several slaves to cotton plantations in Georgia or Alabama. For enslaved people in Maryland, being sold south was a fate worse than death. It meant permanent separation from family, harder labor, and virtual certainty that they would never see their homeland again. The news that she would be torn from her family and sent to the hell of Deep South cotton fields transformed Araminta's simmering anger into focused determination. She was about 27 years old, married to a free black man named John Tubman, and had spent her entire life dreaming of freedom. Now, faced with the prospect of an even worse form of bondage, she made a decision that would change American history. She would not wait to be sold south. She would not accept a fate chosen by others. Instead, she would choose her own path, even if it led to death in the Maryland wilderness. The scared child who had once hidden in a pig pen was gone, replaced by a woman whose courage would soon become legendary. Araminta Ross was about to become Harriet Tubman, and the Underground Railroad was about to gain its most fearless conductor. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable careers in the history of American resistance. From the slave quarters of Dorchester County, a woman was emerging who would repeatedly venture into the heart of slave territory to lead others to freedom. She would operate under the noses of federal marshals, state militias, and professional slave catchers. She would guide terrified fugitives through hundreds of miles of hostile territory, using nothing but her wits, her faith, and her unshakable belief that freedom was the birthright of every human being. But first, she had to save herself. The decision crystallized in Harriet's mind on a humid September night in 1849. She lay on the straw mattress in her family's cabin, listening to her husband John's steady breathing beside her. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, she could hear the mournful sound of a screech owl calling from the marshlands, a sound that enslaved people often interpreted as an omen. Tomorrow, she knew, might be her last day on the Thompson plantation. The slave trader was expected within the week. John Tubman stirred in his sleep, and Harriet studied his face in the moonlight filtering through their small window. He was a free black man, born to parents who had earned their freedom years earlier. Their marriage in 1844 had been a source of both joy and frustration for Harriet. While she loved John deeply, she couldn't understand his acceptance of her enslaved status. When she spoke of escape, he would shake his head and warn her that the penalties for recapture were too severe. "We have a good life here," he would say. "Why risk everything for something that might kill you?" But John's definition of good and Harriet's were worlds apart. As a free man, he could come and go as he pleased, earn wages, and dream of a future. Harriet remained property, subject to being sold, separated from family, or punished at her master's whim. The approaching sale to the Deep South had made the difference between their situations unbearably clear. John could choose to follow her or start over with someone else. She faced the choice between freedom and death. The catalyst for action came the next morning, when Harriet overheard a conversation between Edward Brodess, her current master, and slave trader Nat Turner, not the famous rebel, but a man who shared his name and profession. They stood near the tobacco barn, discussing prices per head and transportation arrangements. "The girl's got them sleeping fits," Brodess was saying, "but she's strong as an ox when she's awake. Good breeding stock, if nothing else." The casual cruelty of being discussed like livestock sent rage coursing through Harriet's veins. That evening, she made her final preparations with methodical precision. She had been planning this moment for years, gathering information and resources whenever possible. Now it was time to put that knowledge to use. Her first stop was her father Ben's cabin. As a free man with deep roots in the community, Ben had connections throughout Dorchester County's network of free and enslaved black people. Over the years, he had carefully mapped the Underground Railroad's routes through Maryland, memorizing the locations of safe houses, sympathetic families, and dangerous areas to avoid. "Daddy," Harriet whispered, as she slipped into his cabin after midnight. "It's time." Ben had been expecting this conversation for months. He rose from his bed and gathered materials he had been secretly preparing: a small bag of cornbread and salt pork, a worn map drawn on cloth that showed waterways and roads between Maryland and Pennsylvania, and most precious of all, the names and locations of Underground Railroad contacts. "First house belongs to Thomas Garrett," Ben murmured, his voice barely audible. "He's a Quaker in Wilmington, Delaware. White man, but he's helped hundreds of our people. You tell him Benjamin Ross sent you, and he'll know you're genuine." Ben pressed a small wooden token into Harriet's hand, a carved bird that would serve as identification when she reached Garrett's station. The Underground Railroad operated on a network of coded communications and trusted references. Conductors like the ones Harriet hoped to contact moved freedom seekers from station to station, usually under cover of darkness. Station masters provided safe houses, food, clothing, and information about the next leg of the journey. The system worked because it combined careful organization with improvisation, allowing conductors to adapt when circumstances changed. Ben explained the basic signals Harriet would need to recognize. A yellow ribbon tied to a fence post meant a house was safe for the night. A quilt with a particular pattern hanging on a clothesline indicated whether the coast was clear or patrollers were nearby. Certain spirituals hummed at specific times could identify friend from foe. Most importantly, the North Star would be her constant guide, not just the actual star, but the network of people who had chosen that name as their symbol of hope. Over the next 3 days, Harriet refined her escape plan with the precision of a military operation. She studied the phases of the moon, knowing that the darkest nights would provide the best cover. She memorized the schedule of local patrollers, identifying the hours when they would be least vigilant. She practiced moving silently through the woods behind the plantation, timing how long it took to reach various landmarks. Her biggest challenge was emotional rather than logistical. Leaving meant abandoning her family, possibly forever. Old Rit, now in her 60s, might not survive long enough to see her daughter again. Her brothers and sisters would face increased scrutiny and possible punishment once her escape was discovered. The weight of these consequences threatened to paralyze her with guilt. The solution came during one of her prayer meetings, held in the depths of Dorchester County's forests. About 20 enslaved people had gathered around a small fire, their voices rising in spiritual songs that masked their conversations about resistance and hope. Sister Mary, an elderly woman known for her prophetic visions, spoke words that would echo in Harriet's mind forever. "Child," Mary said, placing weathered hands on Harriet's shoulders, "the Lord don't call us to stay comfortable in chains. He calls us to break free so we can come back for others. Moses didn't stay in Egypt to keep Pharaoh's house tidy. He went to the Promised Land first, then came back to lead his people out." The comparison to Moses resonated deeply with Harriet's spiritual worldview. She had always felt called to something greater than personal survival, and Sister Mary's words crystallized that calling into a mission. Escape would not be selfish abandonment of her family. It would be the first step in a larger plan to lead others to freedom. If this story is gripping you, don't forget to like the video and comment what you would do in the protagonist's place. Subscribe for more powerful narratives of struggle and survival. With her mission clarified, Harriet began developing the psychological tools she would need to succeed as a conductor. Leading terrified people through hundreds of miles of hostile territory would require more than knowledge of routes and safe houses. She would need to inspire confidence in people who had every reason to despair, maintain discipline when panic threatened to destroy the group, and make life or death decisions under extreme pressure. She practiced these skills by becoming an informal leader among the enslaved people on nearby plantations. When conflicts arose between workers, they brought their disputes to Harriet for resolution. Her head injury, rather than diminishing her authority, had somehow enhanced it. People believed that her visions gave her special insight into situations and individuals. More importantly, her willingness to confront injustice directly had earned her a reputation for fearless integrity. One incident from this period illustrated Harriet's developing leadership style. A young enslaved man named Samuel had been caught trying to learn to read from scraps of newspaper. The overseer planned to make an example of him with a public whipping, that would discourage others from seeking education. The night before Samuel's punishment, Harriet organized a coordinated response. She arranged for several enslaved people to create distractions throughout the plantation during the scheduled whipping. While the overseer was dealing with an accidentally broken plow in the north field, a small fire in the tobacco barn, and missing chickens from the hen house, Harriet spirited Samuel away to a hiding place in the marshlands. When the overseer finally tracked him down hours later, he was too exhausted and frustrated to carry out the planned punishment with its intended dramatic effect. More significantly, Harriet had demonstrated that organized resistance could be effective even within the constraints of plantation life. She had shown other enslaved people that they didn't have to passively accept every injustice, and that careful planning could overcome seemingly impossible odds. These lessons would prove crucial when she began conducting people to freedom. As September turned to October, Harriet refined the specific details of her escape route. The journey from Dorchester County to Pennsylvania covered roughly 90 miles through some of the most dangerous territory in America. Maryland's eastern shore was crawling with patrollers, federal marshals, and professional slave catchers who earned bounties for returning fugitives to bondage. The first leg of her planned route would take her north through the forests and marshlands she had known since childhood. By traveling at night and staying off main roads, she could reach the Choptank River without being detected. The river presented both an opportunity and a challenge. It flowed generally northeast toward Delaware Bay, providing a natural guide toward free territory, but crossing it would require either swimming or finding a boat. Ben had taught her about a network of free black watermen who operated small boats along the Chesapeake Bay tributaries. These men, many of them former slaves themselves, had developed a sophisticated system for helping freedom seekers cross dangerous waterways. They used coded signals, specific arrangements of nets and sails to communicate with each other and identify safe passage opportunities. From the Choptank River, Harriet's route would take her into Delaware, where the density of Quaker settlements provided relatively safe passage for Underground Railroad travelers. Thomas Garrett's station in Wilmington represented the most crucial waypoint in her journey. If she could reach Garrett safely, he would provide food, rest, and guidance for the final push into Pennsylvania. The psychological preparation proved as demanding as the logistical planning. Harriet spent hours in prayer and meditation, strengthening her faith for the trials ahead. She practiced controlling her breathing during stressful situations, knowing that panic could prove fatal during her escape. She visualized every aspect of the journey repeatedly, from the moment she left the plantation to her arrival in free territory. Most challenging was the emotional work of preparing to leave John. Despite their philosophical differences about escape, she loved her husband deeply. On their final night together, she tried once more to convince him to come with her. "We could have a real life up north," she whispered. "You could use your carpentry skills and I could work as a cook or seamstress. We'd be free people, John, really free." But John's response crushed her hopes. "You're talking foolishness, Harriet," he said firmly. "I've got everything I need right here. You try to run north and they'll catch you before you reach the county line. Then what? You'll be sold south for sure and I'll never see you again." When she pressed the issue, John made a threat that revealed the depth of their philosophical divide. "You try to leave, and I'll tell Master Brodess myself. I won't watch you throw your life away on some crazy dream." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound Harriet had ever experienced. The man she had trusted with her deepest hopes and fears was prepared to turn her over to their oppressors rather than support her quest for freedom. That night, lying beside John for the last time, Harriet made peace with the loneliness that would define much of her future life. She would have to find strength within herself and her faith, because even the people closest to her could not be trusted with her dreams. On October 17th, 1849, everything was ready. The moon was in its darkest phase. Local patrollers were focused on a harvest celebration in Cambridge, and Ben had received word that Thomas Garrett was expecting travelers. Harriet spent the day working normally in the tobacco fields, giving no sign of her intentions. She shared meals with her family, participated in evening prayers, and kissed John goodnight as if it were any other day. But when the plantation settled into sleep, Harriet rose silently from her mattress. She had hidden her escape supplies in a hollow tree near the edge of the plantation, the small bag of food Ben had prepared, the cloth map showing waterways and safe houses, and the wooden bird token that would identify her to Underground Railroad contacts. She also carried something else, a small knife that Ben had given her, with instructions to use it on herself rather than allow recapture. Freedom or death. Ben had whispered, when he pressed the weapon into her hand. Those are the only choices worth having. As Harriet slipped from the slave quarters and entered the forest that would either deliver her to freedom or become her grave, she carried with her everything she had learned about survival, leadership, and courage. Her childhood experiences in the marshlands had taught her to move silently and read natural signs. Her years of fieldwork had built the physical strength she would need for the grueling journey ahead. Her spiritual practices had prepared her to trust in divine guidance when human wisdom failed. Most importantly, her recent months of planning and preparation had transformed her from a desperate fugitive into something far more dangerous to the slave system, a woman with a mission that extended beyond personal salvation. She wasn't just running away, she was beginning a career that would make her the most wanted woman in the South and the most celebrated conductor on the Underground Railroad. Behind her, the plantation slept peacefully, unaware that they had just lost not only a valuable piece of property, but a future liberator who would return again and again to steal their human chattel. Ahead lay 90 miles of dangerous territory, hostile authorities and uncertain allies. But Harriet Tubman was no longer afraid. She was free, and she was coming back for the others. The forest floor beneath Harriet's bare feet felt cool and damp as she moved through the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. October mist hung low between the pine trees, muffling sound and reducing visibility to just a few yards ahead. She had been walking for 3 hours, following deer paths and creek beds that wound generally northward through Dorchester County's wilderness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush could signal discovery and death. She paused beside a massive oak tree, pressing her back against its rough bark while she listened for sounds of pursuit. In the distance, she could hear the normal nighttime chorus of the Maryland marshlands, frogs croaking near hidden ponds, owls calling from the canopy above, the distant splash of a beaver or muskrat disturbing still water. Nothing suggested that her absence had been discovered yet, but dawn would come in less than 4 hours, and with it would come the daily roll call that would expose her flight. The cloth map Ben had given her was tucked safely in her dress pocket, but Harriet barely needed to consult it. Years of exploring these woods as a child had imprinted the landscape in her memory. She knew that the creek she was following would eventually join the Choptank River, and that the Choptank flowed northeast toward Delaware Bay and the promise of free territory. What she didn't know was whether slave catchers already watched the river crossings, or if the free black watermen Ben had described would be willing to help a lone fugitive woman. As she resumed walking, Harriet began to understand why so few escape attempts succeeded. The physical challenges were brutal, navigating unfamiliar terrain in darkness, covering vast distances on foot while avoiding roads and settlements, finding food and water without leaving traces for trackers to follow. But the psychological pressure was even worse. Every shadow could hide a patroller, every sound might herald bloodhounds, every decision carried life or death consequences. 2 miles from the plantation, Harriet encountered her first real test. The deer path she was following emerged from dense forest onto the edge of a tobacco field belonging to the neighboring Brodess plantation. Crossing the open ground would expose her to observation from the main house, but skirting around the field would add hours to her journey and increase the risk of encountering patrollers on the roads. She crouched at the forest edge, studying the moonlit expanse before her. The tobacco plants had been harvested weeks earlier, leaving stubbled rows that would provide minimal cover. The main house sat dark and silent about half a mile away, but lamplight flickered in one of the slave quarters. Someone was awake, possibly a sick child, or adults talking quietly about their own dreams of freedom. Harriet made her decision with the cold calculation that would characterize all her future Underground Railroad operations. She would cross the field in sections, using the slight depressions between tobacco rows for concealment. If challenged, she would claim to be returning from late-night medical assistance. Enslaved people often served as midwives and healers for neighboring plantations, making nocturnal travel between properties relatively common. She began her crossing, moving in a low crouch that kept her silhouette below the tobacco stubble. Halfway across the field, disaster nearly struck. A dog began barking near the main house, its sharp voice cutting through the night silence like a blade. Harriet froze, her muscles tensed to run, as lights appeared in the house windows. Voices called out questions. "What's got into that fool dog?" And, "Somebody check the smokehouse." But then a different voice, calm and authoritative, silenced the others. "Just a raccoon or possum, most likely. Dog'll quiet down in a minute." The lights disappeared one by one as the household returned to sleep. Harriet waited another 10 minutes before continuing her crossing, offering a silent prayer of gratitude for whoever had diffused the situation. By 3 a.m., she reached the banks of the Choptank River. The waterway stretched before her like a dark mirror reflecting the stars, wider than she had remembered from childhood visits. The current moved steadily northeast, just as Ben had promised. But swimming across would be impossible. The water was too cold, the distance too great, and her limited swimming skills would never sustain her for such a crossing. This was where Ben's network of contacts was supposed to help. According to her father's information, free black watermen used coded signals to communicate with underground railroad travelers. A small fire built in a specific pattern would alert friendly boatmen that someone needed passage, but building a fire would also alert hostile observers, and Harriet had no way of knowing who might be watching the river crossing. She spent the next hour walking along the riverbank, searching for signs of the watermen Ben had described. Near a small dock used for loading timber onto barges, she found what she was looking for: 3 fishing nets hanging from poles in a triangular arrangement. According to Ben's instructions, this pattern meant safe passage was available for freedom seekers. Harriet gathered driftwood and dry grass, arranging them in the signal pattern Ben had taught her. A small central fire surrounded by 4 smaller piles of kindling. When lit, the arrangement would create a cross-shaped pattern visible from boats on the river. She struck flint to steel, coaxing flames from the tinder with hands that trembled from cold and nervous tension. The fire caught just as dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon. Within minutes, she heard the splash of oars cutting through water. A small boat emerged from the river mist, propelled by a powerful black man who looked to be in his 40s. He brought his vessel close to shore but didn't immediately speak, studying Harriet carefully in the growing light. "Benjamin Ross sent me," Harriet whispered, showing him the carved wooden bird her father had given her. The boatman's expression relaxed slightly, and he nodded toward his craft. "Get in quick," he said quietly. "Name's Jacob, and this crossing ain't getting any safer with daylight coming." Harriet waded into the shallows and climbed aboard as Jacob extinguished her signal fire with river water. Within moments, they were moving steadily across the Choptank toward Delaware territory. During the crossing, Jacob provided crucial intelligence about the journey ahead. "Patrol has been extra active this week," he reported. "Something got them stirred up. Maybe word of runaways from down Virginia way. You stay off the roads completely until you reach Wilmington. Thomas Garrett's still taking folks through, but his house is being watched. You'll need to approach careful like." He also shared disturbing news about the recently passed fugitive slave law, which had dramatically increased the dangers facing freedom seekers. Federal marshals could now compel citizens to assist in capturing runaways, and the penalties for helping enslaved people escape had been severely increased. "Even in Pennsylvania, you ain't completely safe," Jacob warned. "Slave catchers operating all the way up to Philadelphia now." They reached the Delaware shore just as full daylight arrived. Jacob guided his boat to a hidden inlet surrounded by tall marsh grass, where a crude dock provided access to dry land. "Follow that path through the marsh for about 2 miles, he instructed, pointing toward a barely visible track. "You'll come to a Quaker meeting house. Woman there named Sarah Bradford. She'll feed you and point you toward the next station." Harriet thanked Jacob and began the next phase of her journey, walking through Delaware marshland as the sun climbed higher in the sky. She was exhausted after a night of constant travel, but stopping now would be catastrophic. Every hour increased the likelihood that her absence had been discovered and pursuit organized. Somewhere behind her, bloodhounds might already be following her scent trail from the plantation. The path through the Delaware marsh proved treacherous, winding between pools of standing water and patches of quicksand that could trap an unwary traveler. Harriet's childhood experience in Maryland's similar terrain served her well, as she learned to test each step and identify safe routes across unstable ground. But the mental strain of constant vigilance was beginning to tell. Her vision grew blurry from exhaustion, and twice she had to stop and rest when her head injury triggered brief sleeping episodes. During one of these involuntary rest periods, Harriet experienced a vision that would haunt her memory for years. She saw herself standing in a vast field filled with people in chains, all looking toward her with desperate hope in their eyes. A voice, which she believed to be God speaking directly to her, told her that this was only the beginning of her mission. "You will return for them," the voice said, "again and again until all my children are free." The vision ended abruptly when she heard dogs barking in the distance behind her. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized the distinctive baying of bloodhounds on a scent trail. Somehow trackers had already discovered her route and were following her through the marsh. She was still hours away from the Quaker meeting house, and the open terrain offered no places to hide from determined pursuit. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Harriet forced herself to think strategically. Bloodhounds followed scent trails, but water could disrupt their ability to track. The marsh around her was filled with streams and pools that might mask her passage if she could reach them without leaving tracks. She began moving toward the sound of running water, stepping carefully on rocks and fallen logs to avoid leaving footprints in the soft mud. The stream she found was deeper and faster than expected, fed by recent rains that had swollen Delaware's waterways. Harriet waded into the current, gasping as cold water reached her chest. The stream bed was rocky and uneven, making each step a struggle against the current's pull. But behind her, the baying of bloodhounds was growing louder, spurring her forward through the numbing water. She followed the stream for nearly a mile, her legs growing weaker with each step as hypothermia began to set in. Just when she felt she could go no further, the watercourse brought her to higher ground, where a simple wooden building stood among tall pine trees. A hand-painted sign identified it as the Duck Creek Friends Meeting House, the Quaker sanctuary Jacob had described. Harriet stumbled from the stream and approached the meeting house with the last of her strength. Her clothes were soaked, her body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. She knocked weakly on a side door, praying that Sarah Bradford would be present and willing to help a desperate fugitive. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged white woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression. Sarah Bradford took one look at Harriet's condition and immediately pulled her inside, wrapping her in warm blankets and guiding her to a chair near a small wood stove. "Child, you look half drowned," Sarah said softly. "Let's get you warm and fed before we talk about where you're headed." Over the next hour, as Harriet thawed out beside the stove and consumed bowl after bowl of hot soup, Sarah Bradford proved why Quaker meeting houses had become crucial stations on the Underground Railroad. She asked no unnecessary questions, made no judgments about Harriet's decision to escape, and focused entirely on providing practical assistance for the journey ahead. "Thomas Garrett's station in Wilmington is your best bet for reaching Pennsylvania safely," Sarah confirmed. But Jacob was right about increased surveillance. Federal marshals been checking every house known for Underground Railroad activity. "You'll need to approach Garrett's place from the back, through the colored section of town where strangers don't draw as much attention." She provided Harriet with dry clothes, sturdy shoes, and a small bundle of food that would sustain her for the final leg of her journey. More importantly, Sarah gave her a detailed description of the route to Wilmington and the specific signals Harriet would need to identify Garrett's house safely. "Look for a 2-story brick house with green shutters on Shipley Street," Sarah instructed. "There'll be a small garden in back with a particular arrangement of flowers, marigolds planted in the shape of a cross. That's how you know it's safe to approach. If the flower's been disturbed or arranged differently, it means danger, and you should move on to the backup station." As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Harriet prepared to leave the sanctuary that had probably saved her life. The sound of bloodhounds had faded hours earlier. Apparently her water crossing had successfully confused their scent trail, but she knew that professional slave catchers would not give up easily, and every hour she remained in Delaware increased the risk of recapture. Sarah Bradford walked her to the edge of the meeting house property, where a well-worn path disappeared into dense forest. "This trail will take you most of the way to Wilmington without crossing main roads," she explained. "Stay alert for other travelers. Not everyone in these woods is friendly to your kind of journey." The final 20 miles to Wilmington tested every reserve of strength and courage Harriet possessed. Her body ached from 2 days of constant travel. Her feet were blistered and bleeding inside the shoes Sarah had provided, and exhaustion threatened to overcome her with every step. But the knowledge that freedom lay just ahead drove her forward through pain and weariness that would have stopped a less determined person. As darkness fell again, Harriet reached the outskirts of Wilmington. The city was larger than any place she had ever seen, with hundreds of houses, businesses, and workshops spreading along the Christina River. Gas lamps lit the main streets, creating pools of light that she carefully avoided as she made her way toward Shipley Street and Thomas Garrett's station. Finding the house proved more challenging than expected. Wilmington's colored section was a maze of narrow streets and alleyways where free black families, escaped slaves, and Underground Railroad workers lived in an uneasy mixture of hope and fear. Harriet had to ask directions twice, claiming to be looking for domestic work, before she located the brick house with green shutters. The garden behind Garrett's house contained the signal Sarah Bradford had described, marigolds planted in a cross pattern that indicated safe passage was available. Harriet approached the back door and knocked softly, using the coded rhythm Ben had taught her. 3 quick taps. Pause. 2 slow taps. Pause. 3 quick taps again. Thomas Garrett himself answered the door, a tall, dignified Quaker, whose gentle demeanor masked the iron determination that had led him to help over 2,700 enslaved people reach freedom. He took one look at Harriet's exhausted condition and immediately ushered her inside, where his wife Hannah had already prepared food and a place to rest. "Welcome to freedom, sister," Garrett said simply. "Thee has made a remarkable journey, and thy courage does honor to thy people and thy God." For the first time since leaving Maryland 3 days earlier, Harriet allowed herself to believe that she might actually survive. The most dangerous part of her journey lay behind her, and ahead was Pennsylvania, free soil where no slave catcher could legally drag her back into bondage. But as she sat in Thomas Garrett's kitchen, eating her first meal as a free woman, Harriet's thoughts were not on her own safety. Instead, she found herself thinking about the family she had left behind, the friends still laboring in Maryland's tobacco fields, and the millions of enslaved people throughout the South who shared her dreams of freedom. The vision she had experienced in the Delaware Marsh returned to her with startling clarity, countless faces looking to her with desperate hope, waiting for someone brave enough to lead them out of bondage. That night, as she slept safely in the Garrett household, Harriet Tubman began planning her return to Maryland. Her own escape had been just the beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the streets of Philadelphia as Harriet stepped off the ferry that had carried her across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. It was October 22, 1849, exactly 5 days since she had slipped away from the Maryland plantation that had held her in bondage for 27 years. Thomas Garrett had arranged her passage to the city, providing contacts and enough money to sustain her for several weeks while she found work and lodging. Standing on the Philadelphia docks, surrounded by the bustling activity of America's second-largest city, Harriet experienced a moment of profound disorientation. The air itself felt different here, charged with possibility rather than oppression. White and black people moved through the streets together, conducting business and conversation without the rigid hierarchy that had defined every interaction in Maryland. For the first time in her life, Harriet was not someone's property. But freedom, she quickly discovered, was more complex than she had imagined. The exhilaration of escape was tempered by crushing loneliness and the constant fear of recapture. The fugitive slave law meant that even in Pennsylvania, she was not completely safe from bounty hunters and federal marshals. Every knock on her boarding house door could signal disaster. Every unfamiliar face might belong to someone tracking her for the reward money. Philadelphia's substantial free black community welcomed Harriet with warmth and practical assistance. She found lodging in a boarding house run by Sarah and William Still, who would later become famous as the unofficial historian of the Underground Railroad. William Still kept meticulous records of every freedom seeker who passed through Philadelphia, documenting their stories and tracking their progress toward permanent safety. Through the Still family, Harriet connected with the city's network of abolitionists, both black and white. She attended meetings of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, where she heard speakers like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth describe the moral imperative to end slavery throughout America. These gatherings opened her eyes to the broader movement that was challenging the institution that had held her people in bondage. But it was the stories shared by other escaped slaves that truly shaped Harriet's future mission. Every week brought new arrivals at William Still's boarding house, men, women, and children who had risked everything to reach free soil. They told harrowing tales of separation from family members, brutal punishments, and the daily degradation of slavery. More heartbreakingly, they spoke of the loved ones left behind, still trapped in the system they had escaped. Harriet found work as a domestic servant in the home of a wealthy Quaker family, the Bracketts, who treated her with respect and paid fair wages for her labor. For the first time in her life, she could keep the money she earned, make decisions about her own time, and dream of a future beyond mere survival. The Bracketts encouraged her to learn to read and write, skills that had been forbidden to enslaved people, but were essential for full participation in free society. As winter settled over Philadelphia, Harriet should have felt content with her new life. She had achieved what millions of enslaved people could only dream of: freedom, honest work, and the promise of a better future. But instead of satisfaction, she felt a growing sense of incompleteness. The vision she had experienced in the Delaware Marsh haunted her dreams, filled with faces of people still waiting for deliverance. The breaking point came in December 1849, when Harriet received devastating news from Maryland. Her niece, Keziah Jolly, and Keziah's 2 young children were about to be sold at auction in Cambridge. The letter, smuggled north through the Underground Railroad network, came from Harriet's brother-in-law, John Bowley, a free black man who was desperate to save his wife and children from being sold to the Deep South. That night, as snow fell outside her warm Philadelphia bedroom, Harriet made a decision that would transform her from refugee to legend. She would return to Maryland, not as a fugitive seeking escape, but as a conductor ready to guide others to freedom. The risks were enormous. Captured conductors faced death or sailed to the harshest plantations in the Deep South. But the moral imperative was even greater. Her first rescue mission in December 1850 established the pattern that would define her career as the Underground Railroad's most famous conductor. Working with her brother-in-law, John Bowley, Harriet orchestrated an elaborate plan to steal Keziah and the children from the Cambridge slave auction. Bowley attended the auction and submitted the winning bid for his own family, then spirited them away before payment was due. Harriet waited in a safe house near the Chesapeake Bay, ready to guide them north to freedom. The plan worked flawlessly, but it also revealed how much the political landscape had changed since Harriet's own escape. The fugitive slave law had emboldened slave catchers and created a climate of fear even in free states. Federal marshals actively patrolled the Underground Railroad routes, and the penalties for assisting runaways had increased dramatically. What had been a dangerous enterprise was now potentially suicidal. But danger only strengthened Harriet's resolve. Over the next decade, she would make 19 trips into slave territory, personally leading over 300 people to freedom. Her success rate was unprecedented. She never lost a single person under her guidance, earning the nickname Moses from the enslaved people who saw her as a prophet of liberation. Each mission required months of careful planning and precise execution. Harriet developed a sophisticated intelligence network that included free black people, sympathetic whites, and even enslaved people who gathered information about patrol schedules, safe houses, and potential dangers. She learned to forge documents, alter her appearance, and impersonate various characters to avoid detection. Her psychological understanding of both fugitive slaves and their pursuers became legendary. When terrified freedom seekers wanted to turn back, threatening to compromise the entire group, Harriet would pull out a pistol and give them a simple choice. Dead slaves tell no tales, but live slaves do. You'll go on or die. Her determination was so absolute that no one ever tested her resolve. The Underground Railroad network that supported Harriet's missions represented one of the most effective resistance movements in American history. Thousands of conductors, station masters, and supporters risked imprisonment or death to help enslaved people reach freedom. The system operated across racial lines, uniting Quakers, freed slaves, abolitionists, and ordinary citizens who believed that human bondage was morally indefensible. Thomas Garrett alone spent his entire fortune supporting Underground Railroad operations, helping over 2,700 people escape bondage. When fined by federal courts for violating the fugitive slave law, he publicly declared his intention to continue helping freedom seekers until his last dollar was spent and his last breath drawn. William Still kept detailed records that preserved the names and stories of thousands of people whose courage helped dismantle American slavery. Harriet's success inspired other conductors and emboldened enslaved people throughout the South. Stories of the mysterious woman who repeatedly penetrated slave territory and led groups to freedom spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. Masters offered increasingly large bounties for her capture, eventually reaching $40,000, equivalent to over $1 million today, but she continued operating with impunity. Her most audacious mission came in 1857, when she returned to Maryland to rescue her elderly parents, Ben and Old Rit. Both were in their 70s and barely able to walk, making them seemingly impossible candidates for the grueling journey to freedom. But Harriet constructed a crude wagon, disguised her parents as an invalid couple being transported for medical treatment, and successfully conducted them to Canada. The psychological impact on slaveholders was devastating. If a woman they dismissed as mentally damaged could repeatedly humiliate their security measures, what did that say about their control over enslaved people? Harriet's success exposed the vulnerability of the entire system, demonstrating that determined resistance could overcome seemingly impossible odds. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Harriet immediately volunteered her services to the Union Army. Her knowledge of Southern territory, connections with enslaved people, and reputation for successful covert operations made her invaluable as a spy and scout. She led intelligence-gathering missions behind Confederate lines, providing crucial information about troop movements and supply lines. Her most spectacular military achievement came in June 1863, when she planned and guided the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina. Leading a force of 300 Union soldiers, mostly former slaves, Harriet orchestrated an attack that destroyed Confederate supply lines and liberated over 750 enslaved people. It was the first military operation in American history planned and executed by a woman. The raid's success demonstrated how enslaved people would respond when given the opportunity to fight for their own freedom. Hundreds of formerly enslaved men joined the Union Army immediately after the raid, bringing intimate knowledge of Southern terrain and supply networks. Harriet's military service proved that the Underground Railroad's tactics could be adapted for conventional warfare. After the war ended in 1865, Harriet continued fighting for human rights and social justice. She established schools for formerly enslaved people in South Carolina, worked with the Freedmen's Bureau to provide assistance to refugees, and advocated for women's suffrage alongside Susan B. Anthony and other feminist leaders. Her activism demonstrated that the struggle for freedom extended beyond the abolition of slavery to encompass full equality and human dignity. But the post-war period also brought profound disappointment. The promises of Reconstruction were betrayed by political compromise, and the rise of Jim Crow laws created new forms of oppression for African Americans. Harriet watched as many of the gains achieved through decades of struggle were systematically undermined by white supremacist violence and discriminatory legislation. In her later years, Harriet established the Harriet Tubman Home for aged African Americans in Auburn, New York, providing care for elderly people who had no family support. The facility operated on principles of dignity and respect that had guided her Underground Railroad work. Every person deserved care and comfort, regardless of their ability to pay. When Harriet Tubman died on March 10, 1913, at approximately age 91, she was recognized as one of the most important figures in American history. Frederick Douglass had written of her, "The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom and of your heroism." Booker T. Washington called her one of the bravest persons on this continent or any other. Her funeral in Auburn drew hundreds of mourners, including Civil War veterans, former slaves, and civil rights activists who understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. The woman who had risked everything to lead others to freedom was laid to rest with military honors, a recognition of her service to the Union Army and the cause of human liberation. The legacy of Harriet Tubman extends far beyond her individual achievements. She proved that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when motivated by moral conviction and willing to sacrifice personal comfort for the greater good. Her success inspired generations of civil rights activists, from the freedom riders of the 1960s to contemporary movements for social justice. Modern historians recognize Harriet as a master of guerrilla warfare, whose tactics influenced military thinking about irregular operations and resistance movements. Her ability to operate effectively in hostile territory while maintaining the loyalty and discipline of her followers offers lessons for anyone seeking to challenge oppressive systems. Perhaps most importantly, Harriet Tubman demonstrated that freedom is not a gift to be granted by those in power, but a right to be seized by those with the courage to claim it. She showed that the most effective response to injustice is not passive resistance, but active intervention on behalf of those who cannot save themselves. In 2020, the United States Treasury Department announced plans to redesign the $20 bill to feature Harriet Tubman's image, replacing Andrew Jackson, a slaveholder and architect of Native American genocide. The change, though delayed by political considerations, represents growing recognition that America's currency should honor liberators rather than oppressors. Her Auburn home became a national historical park, preserving the site where she spent her final years providing care for elderly African Americans. The facility continues operating today as a testament to her belief that freedom must be accompanied by dignity and community support for the most vulnerable members of society. Schools, libraries, and streets across America bear Harriet Tubman's name, ensuring that future generations will learn about her contributions to human freedom. But the most fitting memorial to her legacy is the ongoing struggle for justice and equality that continues in communities worldwide. Every person who risks personal safety to help others, every activist who challenges oppressive systems, every individual who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable, carries forward the spirit that drove Harriet Tubman back into slave territory 19 times. The woman who began as Araminta Ross, a piece of property on a Maryland plantation, transformed herself into Harriet Tubman, one of the most consequential figures in American history. Her journey from slavery to freedom to liberation of others proves that individual courage, sustained by moral conviction and supported by communities of resistance, can indeed change the world. Standing in those Philadelphia streets in 1849, exhausted and alone after her escape from bondage, Harriet could not have imagined the legacy she would create. But the vision that came to her in the Delaware marsh proved prophetic. She did return for them again and again until hundreds of enslaved people had followed her to freedom. In doing so, she helped destroy the system that had held her people in chains and created a model of courage that continues inspiring struggles for justice around the world. If this journey moved you, subscribe, like, and comment which part of the story touched you most. Your engagement keeps these voices alive and inspires new content about resistance and courage.